Welcome to Habitat Live. Many co-ops and condos have been eager to apply for the Paycheck Protection Program, and as of April 29th, some have, and a few have received funding. But many are concerned about the legality of doing so, and we wanted to air those concerns. Stuart Saft, partner at Holland Knight, has joined us today to do so. Stu, for most corporations, there are two steps to applying for the PPP. The first is to get approval from your bank, and the second is to get approval and funding from Small Business Administration. Can you explain where the problem lies?
Well, Carol, first of all, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you. In fact, there are three steps. The first step is to apply to the Small Business Administration. The second step is to line up a lender because the Small Business Administration is only guaranteeing the loan. The lender is actually making the loan. And then the third step, which could also be the second step because you could be doing it at the same time, is that if you have a mortgage on the building, you have to go to your lender to make certain that you're not violating the loan covenants in your mortgage by taking out additional funding. And many of the lenders don't have a problem with the additional funding. The problem is the way the Small Business Administration is interpreting the law. When Congress passed the CARES Act, it specifically says that any business can apply for the PPP program. And the idea was get as much money out as possible to keep people working so that they don't go on unemployment and make the coming recession even worse than it's going to be. The Small Business Administration took the position that, according to their regulations, the borrowers had to fall into certain categories, that notwithstanding what Congress said, it could not be any business. And some of the businesses that were excluded was residential real estate ownership and operation, and specifically apartment houses, which they considered to be passive and not subject to the loans. And so initially when the law came, when the SBA issued its regulations, it was very clear about this point. And we tried to do something about it initially. As you know, I was formerly chairman of the National Cooperative Bank. And so the morning after the regulations were issued, I contacted the bank, the president and the general counsel of the bank, and pointed this language out to them. They agreed with my interpretation, and then they tried to build support in Washington to get Congress to do something so that the funds could be available for co-ops and condominiums. And at that point in time, there was no interest in Washington to do anything of the sort. They were exhausted from having negotiated this deal with the White House. I then went to my law firm's Small Business Administration lawyers who were in our Washington office to see if they could come up with some way around this. And they came back with the same interpretation that I had in the Small Business Administration. But at the time, we knew that there were going to be subsequent legislation, there'd be additional funding. And so what we tried to do was get Congress in the next funding, which is what they enacted, to provide that the SBA's interpretation was incorrect and that residential and specifically co-ops and condos wouldn't be excluded from the funding. And there was no interest in doing that. And Congress then enacted what's been referred to as phase 3.5. And the problem there is that by Congress not questioning the Small Business Administration, Congress now has pretty much affirmed that the Small Business Administration's actions are correct, and it would make it virtually impossible for a court to reverse the SBA after after Congress reauthorized the act. And so that's the position that we're in right now.
And
if you just look at the legislation, absolutely any business should be able to apply and get the loan. But based upon the interpretation, a whole segment of business and the population are excluded.
there have been a few co-ops to date who have actually gotten funding from SBA. And the question is, what is the risk? And I don't know exactly what their circumstances are, but if I assume they've had a lot of commercial income that is now gone, and that in fact they are suffering, not just from a few shareholders who can't pay their maintenance. Should these co-op boards continue to keep the money? Should they turn it back? And what's the risk to them?
If I was their attorney, I would advise them to take advantage of the safe harbor that the Small Business Administration has issued, basically saying, if you weren't eligible for funding and you got funding or you applied for the funding, you have until May 7th to withdraw your application. And I say that because no volunteer co-op or condo board should have to go through a federal investigation because they acted as a fiduciary and did something that made sense. Now, the problem is that in both the application that they signed, they confirmed, and on the back, on page 2 of the application, they affirmed that they understood what the eligibility requirements were. They agreed to accede to them, and they understood that there were civil and criminal penalties for violating it. And that's what they signed. And when Congress reauthorized the law a week and a half ago, they made it a little bit worse by saying that there has to be a necessity. When the first wave of money came out, there was no obligation that there was a necessity. There was no requirement that you actually needed the money because you couldn't function without it. And it was basically free money. When they reauthorized it, they added in this idea of necessity, and it's going to be very hard for co-ops and condominiums in New York City to argue that they really have necessity to get the money, because it's not like they're selling products to consumers who aren't on the streets. Every co-op shareholder, condominium unit owner, has an obligation to make their monthly payments. So you have a situation where the board, if they've gotten the money, is in violation of the application that they signed. The government has said, we're going to investigate, and they can't prove necessity. So it's very problematic. And if there's a problem, the problem is not going to become apparent for 2 or 3 years when somebody decides to go in and do an audit. And the problem is that when the legislation was originally enacted, there was $120 million that was set aside for the Inspector General. And the Inspector of the SBA, and the Inspector General's job basically is to investigate wrongdoing with regard to this funding. So Congress created a fund that the SBA can use to go after people to get the money back. So, I think it would be a mistake. I can't tell you, what an individual board should do, but as a board president, I can tell you that I'm not getting paid enough as a board president to risk a federal investigation. But there may be boards that take more of a laissez-faire attitude and don't have a problem with it, but I think it's a mistake.
What would have to change so that you would feel comfortable if your co-op had need? So what would have to change so that you would feel comfortable applying for this kind of funding?
Well, I was hoping that in 3.5 in this recent edition, that Congress would specifically restrict the SBA's interpretation. That didn't happen. Now, there's another funding that's being discussed, and I assume we're going to get it. This was 3.5. There was supposed to be a fourth, which I think we'll still see, and probably a fifth, because the government's, terrified of what this recession is going to look like. And what we would need is very specific language in the legislation saying that this kind of funding for residential apartment operations is permitted. And we tried to get that this last time around, and I know that I know that a group of New York members of Congress have written a letter saying this co-op should be allowed to get this money, but there's no support on the Senate side for doing this. And without Senate support, the law is not going to change, and we're not going to be able to see that funding. And which is the reason why I've been utilizing the National Co-op Bank and the National Cooperative Business Association to try to get support of this, because you can't do it with just House members saying this is something we should do. The problem is, it's like all of our Section 216 problems. It's seen in Washington as a New York problem. And unless you have somebody who understands the issue and who has the power, the New York problem is not going to be solved with national legislation.
Cooperative housing is distinct from residential apartments. So the landlord who owns a rental building is not the same as a cooperative corporation. And do you think there's a possibility of amplifying that distinction?
You need to get a court to come up with an interpretation that would support that. And although there might, it's very possible that a federal district court would come out with that interpretation. It's going to be very hard to get an appellate court to confirm it. So really, the answer to this is legislation rather than a judicial decision.
And what can the co-op community, co-op and condo community in New York do to make our voices heard? What?
Well, I think reaching out to legislators are very helpful. The advantage of working with the National Cooperative Bank, with whom I have no affiliation at the present time, I left the board, I guess, 8 years ago, is that NCB makes loans in every state in the country and makes loans for all kinds of businesses, not just residences, but across the board. And they're very active in the National Cooperative Business Association. So you need a national audience to get support in order to accomplish this. And it's very hard to do because outside of New York, you don't have a great many co-ops that are a great many self-owned housing that are co-ops that aren't affordable housing. You have moderate, and you have affordable, moderate, and luxury of co-op housing in New York, but that's the aberration. In the rest of the country, it's mostly co-op housing is mostly housing that's been funded by the federal government, and they're not going to have this problem, or maybe they will have this problem. But you need a national audience, and you need a national audience for this, particularly in the red states. You need the Senate's support to get something done. Unless there's some horse trading that can go on. There's something that the senators want, that that the Republican senators want, that the Democratic House can hold on to and make a trade. The question then becomes, how important an issue is this for the House? But it needs to go another step, and I don't think you can risk your personal livelihood or finances fighting with the federal government, years from now, after you're off the board, because you violated the statute.
Okay, thank you very much. Much
You're very
appreciated.
welcome. Have a great day.
Thank you.